Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Yvette Alex Asenso, Professor of Political Science, Adjunct Faculty in the Law School, and Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at the University of Oregon. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the African American Workshop and Lecture Series, which was established by President Schill in response to the Black Student Task Force demands for a series that explicitly and implicitly, as well as intentionally, focused on the ways that Black people have contributed to our campus, the state of Oregon, our country, and our world beyond. We thank the Black Student Task Force, the president, for the series, and the DEI team for all of the background preparations that make these events. And of course, we are so grateful to all of you who tune in regularly. As we prepare for President Schill's introduction of our august speaker, we invite you to bring your minds and spirits to this gathering as well. Sit back, relax, and enjoy what's coming. And feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to pose a question for the Q&A that will follow Professor Muhammad's talk. At this juncture, it is my pleasure to introduce President Schill, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Michael Schill, and I'm president of the University of Oregon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's African American Workshop and Lecture Series event. Tonight's lecture features award-winning historian and professor of history, race, and public policy, Khalil Gibran Muhammad. His presentation is going to focus on the role of anti-racist research in higher education and society. Professor Muhammad's talk comes at an important time in our history as we, as a nation and a society, come to grips with generations of racism and, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, commit to dismantling systemic racism with new vigor. We know that higher education can and will play an important role in affecting change. Dealing with systemic racism, though, isn't just about the rest of the world, it's about us. The University of Oregon has been on its own path to becoming a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable institution. And this lecture series is just one initiative that came out of our commitment to bring more Black students, faculty, and perspectives to our campus. We still have much more work to do, but we are making progress. Tonight's lecture offers an opportunity to hear about how higher education can help institutionalize anti-racist values, and for us also to learn more about research that mirrors some of the work beginning at the University of Oregon and at universities across the nation. Professor Muhammad is the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library and a renowned archive of global Black history. His scholarship examines the broad intersections of race, democracy, inequality, and criminal justice in modern US history. He is the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. That book won the John Hope Franklin Prize for Best Book Award in American Studies in 2011. His work has also been featured in a number of national print and broadcast media outlets, including the New York Times as a contributor to the 1619 Project, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, NPR, and MSNBC. Professor Muhammad graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in economics and earned his PhD in American history from Rutgers University. And we have enjoyed having Professor Muhammad with us virtually all day. virtually all day and virtually all day. He has met with Black graduate students and the Black Student Task Force, as well as our history faculty, our Black Studies group, a number of additional faculty, and the provost, me, and Senate leadership. We have all greatly benefited from our conversations. And now it's my pleasure to come onto our screens and talk to us about anti-racist research in universities. Professor Muhammad.
Thank you so much, Professor Presidential. Well, I guess you are Professor.
I like being a professor.
I know, this is a trend, Professor, President and Professor. I like that. Well, listen, I'm delighted to be here. It's been a fabulous day. As I was sharing with so many, I've learned a lot about what's happening at the University of Oregon, and I mean that in a good way. It helps me to contribute to change elsewhere. I take a little bit from each experience. I also want to thank Provost Patrick Phillips and University Senate President Professor Berkman for your leadership and continuing to move this work forward. I know that there are a lot of challenges, and I certainly have a really complicated view of what that looks like, but I think it's the intention and the commitment that will make all the difference. I met with so many amazing faculty members, students, and other administrators that I'm grateful for the time that you took today to be in conversation with me. And of course, for all of you who've signed up to sit as Vice President Alex Asenzo said, to sit back and listen to this lecture. That was a very enthusiastic endorsement. I also want to especially thank Vice President Yvette Alex Asenso, who invited me to be here today. She's really a mentor. She's a leader whom I admire. She's also a family friend. She and her husband, Professor A.B. Asenso, and their two amazing sons were part of our AME church community back in Bloomington, Indiana. There in town and at the university, we were all laboring in the vineyard of educating our students, our colleagues, and the community about how racism and colonialism built the modern world, and how Black people resisted, survived, and often triumphed by making the world better for everyone. We labored long hours, and I have confirmed today that Professor Asenso, AB that is now semi-retired, bless his heart and his health. And so in that spirit, I welcome you to join us in the vineyard. We've been there a long time, and you might be new to it, but I can guarantee you, you will receive the same bounty of knowledge in the service of humanity and truth. The role of anti-racist research in the academy and beyond. So let me begin where most people start, and that is with representation. So by the numbers, it's pretty obvious, but just to lift up a few, in the United States, we have a power gap problem where the concentration of power and decision-making in America is represented overwhelmingly by white men. In the private sector, just to look at the numbers of African Americans, men, women, cis and trans, and those who are non-gender conforming, only about 3% of executives or senior level officials and managers can be counted at the highest levels. Across the nonprofit sector, we see more representation. About 8% of African Americans serve on nonprofit boards, and yet only about 3% are running those organizations in the nonprofit sector. Some of you might have seen this summer, the New York Times did a special on 922 of the most powerful positions in America. They managed to squeeze these tiny little faces into thumbnail images, but they looked across sectors. And the takeaway is that out of those 922 positions, 80% were white and the vast majority of male. When we look closer at what brings us here today, at the university, the college of higher education, we have wide disparities in the percentages now of the white population on various campuses, with some of the whitest campuses ranking as high as 82% of their demographics represented by the white population of Dartmouth, Vanderbilt, University of Wisconsin, Duke, Cornell, high 70s and 80s. And places like Harvard, Yale, and Columbia are at the break-even point, just about 54% white. That's good news, of course. Those elites with their huge endowments, like my own university, are able to do some things in order to close the wealth gap, which of course gets in the way of being able to pay tuition at some of these places. But also everyone is counting foreign-born populations in their diversity numbers, which of course also means that their white populations are diminishing because folks are attracting students from around the globe who can afford to be there. So why do all these representational numbers matter at the beginning of this talk? Well, one, they level set what we are really doing here. And in the end of the day, we are still dealing with the problem of tokenism. This increasing focus on racial representation without what I would call institutional transformation limits what people of color can actually do when they show up to affect change. It's one thing to get folks there, it's another thing to keep them there. We talk a lot about pipelines of how big or small, how effectively these distribution networks deliver people of color into largely unchanged institutions. The business of government, of corporations, or of higher education is not meant, in most cases, it seems to me, to transform in the wake of new people with distinct experiences. Let me give you an example. When I was a first-year assistant professor, and no, it wasn't ancient history, but it was a little while ago, I was asked to help select incoming graduate students. I read dozens and dozens of applications identifying quality prospects. I submitted my recommendations and figured my work was done. Some weeks later, during a department meeting, the chair circulated the list of ranked candidates that we were to vote on. I scanned the list. I saw no names of any candidates I had recommended. From this, I knew there would not be a single African-American candidate admitted to the graduate program in history that year. This seemed impossible to me. Then I realized I had a decision to make. Would I go along with the department in approving a pro forma vote on the new graduate admits? After all, I was a brand new assistant professor in a department as big as 60 faculty members, of whom 3 were self-identified as Black or African-American? Or would I object by dissenting? So I chose to say no. Everyone in a room of about 50 colleagues looked on in shock that I had objected. Many immediately asked after the meeting what was wrong. I told them I did not understand how my senior colleagues could decide that no Black candidate was worthy of admission, particularly after having solicited my perspective as an expert in the subfield. To add insult to injury, the endowment money earmarked for an African-American admit would go unused. None of this made any sense to me. In other words, none of the other white candidates on the list of admissions could even use the money. In a matter of days, an offer was extended to one of those candidates I had selected. He has since graduated with his PhD, has published an excellent first book, a book about the carceral state called Presumed Criminal, helps us understand precisely why policing has so continuously failed Black youth in this country. And he is thriving at Emory University. The lesson here, even when you or someone you know or a group of minorities have been hired by an institution, the goal is still, though changing, usually assimilating those individuals to the culture of the institution. And I have no problem with assimilation in the little a sense of the word. It is the big A construct, or in this case, a kind of colorblindness that I think is a problem. Colorblindness and big A assimilation says to you, we're so glad you're here. Please don't make us uncomfortable by talking about your people or your experiences that are not like ours. You are supposed to be just like us. I also need to remind you that colorblindness is a disability. People can't actually see the full range of colors. This is not something to aspire to. I was supposed to be invisible when no prospective Black graduate names were listed on the admit at Indiana University, where I first started. My Blackness was not supposed to matter. My judgment and discernment of the prospect's potential informed by my experiences were not relevant under the terms of assimilation. My senior colleagues knew better. Now, let me be clear, just at the outset, around just a simple act of speaking up in a moment where the social pressures to just go along to get along is still not something that everyone will sign up for. But know, even there in your silence, you are making a choice. And the choices don't have to fall on the person of color who happens to be in the room when such decisions are made. Because the deck is already stacked to favor a set of experiences already inscribed in the brick and mortar, the endowment, the policies and procedures, what I would call the profit model of the university. You have the choice to assimilate into the existing structure of power and privilege, but don't be surprised if more of you don't show up. Because what would be the point? You bring little different to the institution. You haven't changed its values. You haven't created space for others with your distinct appearance. You haven't changed anything. But that's just where we start this conversation, because our problems extend way beyond representation. In fact, the problem of devaluing anti-racist research and the presence of those who bring a perspective and a knowledge base into the university is a public health crisis, a global economic crisis. It's an educational crisis, and perhaps most profoundly in this moment, it is a democracy crisis. The scenes on Capitol Hill just a week ago show a nation facing an existential crisis. The Charlottesville Riot set, of course, with the backdrop of the University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson, was a dress rehearsal for the Capitol uprising. Some of the same people, same violence, same love of the symbols of hate, waving the Confederate flag, and or in the case of the National Mall, installing an actual gallows or lynching scaffold. I have lectured at roughly 200 colleges and universities over the past decade. I have talked with hundreds of students, faculty, and administrators about campus climate issues, resources, faculty recruitment and retention, about free speech versus racist pranks and spectacles of terror. I've heard it and seen it all across this expansive nation, and I've seen just how intricately linked what happens on our campuses and what is happening in our nation and indeed the world. So here's a few thoughts about what I've learned. African American studies, along with ethnic studies, along with women and gender studies and disability studies, are often the mini stepchildren in higher education, treated as wards of the university. Of course, the humanities themselves have been targeted for cuts by state legislatures for many years now, and according to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences report in 2013, of which I participated in, the federal government has cut funding to the humanities by 50%. I don't want to diminish the problem of austerity in higher education and its pernicious impact on many aspects of the university. But I can assure you from my time on the road, well, in some cases virtually too, most administrators and many faculty members do not conceive of African American studies or Black studies or anti-racist research more generally as a bellwether, or to borrow the now retired law professor Lonnie Guinier's metaphor, that somehow these people with this race knowledge or African Americans are the canaries in the coal mine of the nation. Rich and poor, large and small institutions, as well as campuses with above average and those with below average enrollments of Black students, all behave very similarly in how they justify the chronic underinvestment in, say, Black studies or anti-racist research. Administrators point to the evidence of too few majors, lower H-index and citation counts with regard to faculty research, and mixed teaching reviews. All of these are, of course, part of a market-driven ecosystem in higher education, mirroring market-based logics outside the university in business and in politics. These are just two examples of how pernicious market-driven decision-making can be. Every time there is a mass shooting in America, gun sales skyrocket. And close to half the country voted for political leaders who believe the notion that we ought to abandon democratic norms and institutions because Black and brown, as well as naturalized and first-generation immigrant citizens of color, are not actually Americans deserving of equal justice and protection under the Constitution. The economic and political marketplace outside the university have simultaneously produced the greatest period of economic inequality in America and the greatest threat to American democracy since the Civil War. And while I cannot assure everyone on this webinar, I cannot be assured that everyone on this webinar agrees with my characterization of our national state of affairs, I suspect more than a few of you understand that race and racism, white nationalism, neo-Nazism, and white supremacy are primary factors in what is happening. Today, of course, for the first time in US history, a president was impeached for a second time. So I ask you, where in the university should we look for intellectual leadership, guidance, and a place to interpret and make sense of who we are as a nation? Where should we expect to find the social science data, the psychological frameworks, the historical context, the literature of people who've stared in the abyss of darkness and obliteration and found the strength to survive and the spirit to sing songs, to make poetry, to lift their voices to inspire others that a better day is coming. The small number of majors, low citation counts, and bad teaching reviews from students like the one who told me in May of 2010 that the best way I could improve my teaching was to kill myself. That spring, I'd happened to be teaching a survey course on US history where the Tea Party movement was mobilizing, and I was still working in the great state of Indiana. All these higher education market indicators of my low value to some of my students, and for others in the broader universities, their work are outcomes of a society that systematically devalues Black lives. If Black people as a visible minority only ever waited for a majority of white people to buy what they were selling, or to give them liberty, or to give them death, Black people would have been killed off from these shores a long time ago. Most universities delude themselves and others about how much they value diversity and despise systemic racism. Aisha Ahmad, an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto, calls this the Great Gaslighting. She writes, "One of the great absurdities is that colleges admit that systemic racism is real and wrong, yet also fail to acknowledge it in any specific case. A hiring committee that once again failed to shortlist any BIPOC candidates, that is Black, Indigenous people, or people of color. That lab that has never recruited or promoted any women of color. In practice," she writes, "colleges are cesspools of denial. Racism exists, but not here, not us, not me." I recently served on a hiring committee for a senior scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School to run our program in criminal justice. A program, by the way, that Bill Bratton, the former retired police chief, America's top cop, served in Boston, New York City twice, LA, helped to actually build the infrastructure of stop and frisk policing at the Harvard Kennedy School. This is Bill Bratton's celebrated legacy that he talks about. In any case, we're looking to hire a new person to lead that work here in the 21st century. And it turns out that when we were soliciting reference letters to evaluate the candidates, in the form letter where we at Harvard tell someone else somewhere else, please tell us how good or bad these candidates are, we list the fields that they ought to be compared to and the subject areas that they ought to have expertise in. And I was new to this process at Harvard. And so when I reviewed the form letter, I noted that not a single person whose home department, whose FTE resided in African American studies or Black studies or ethnic studies or critical race studies, in any of those fields was being asked to weigh in on our choice to hire someone to run our program in criminal justice. Also, when we listed the subject areas that people ought to be expert in, racism nowhere appeared. And so I use this example because it seems to me that these are not malicious acts of exclusion today. At least I didn't think so. These are traditions of exclusion that in the end are traces, artifacts of a long history. And they cannot be dismantled if people are not intentionally looking to dismantle them. I spoke up, they changed the letter, but it's clear to me that that didn't lead to changing letters in other search committees, which means that it's still up to me to make that happen. And that's a shame. Goodwill is not a substitute for good work. Imagine what this country might have become just in the past generation if every student in high school and in college were reading Toni Morrison. That is the kind of literature on race and racism that even my colleagues at Harvard are not too conversant in when it comes to choosing candidates. I first read her my senior year in high school because I was lucky enough to take an elective on African American literature. In a recent anthology, The Source of Self-Regard, selected essays, speeches, and meditations by Toni Morrison shortly before her passing, there's a 1995 reprinted essay where she warned of the inextricable link between racism and fascism. She wrote that before the final solution, there is a first solution, a second one, even a third. She outlined 10 steps, and here they are. She said, construct an internal enemy, isolate and demonize that enemy, distribute information about the enemy, silence those in defense of the enemy, promote scientific racism and myths of racial superiority, prepare, budget for, and rationalize the building of holding arenas, note, immigrant cages, for the enemy, especially its males and absolutely its children. Reward mindlessness and apathy with monumentalized entertainment, and finally maintain at all costs silence. Republican Party. She continued, in 1995, racism may wear a new dress, buy a new pair of boots, but neither it nor its succubus twin fascism is new or can make anything new. It can only reproduce the environment that supports its own health, fear, denial, and an atmosphere in which its victims have lost the will to fight. The forces interested in fascist solutions to national problems are not to be found in one political party or another, or in one or another wing of any single political party. Democrats have no unsullied history of egalitarianism, nor are liberals free of domination agendas. Republicans have housed abolitionists and white supremacists, conservative, moderate, liberal, right, left, hard left, far right, religious, secular, socialist. We must not be blindsided by these Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola labels, because the genius of fascism is that any political structure can host the virus, and virtually any developed country can become a suitable home. Fascism talks ideology, but it is really just marketing for power. Now, of course, that was almost 25 years before a celebrity television host became president of the United States. This is what anti-racist research and literature produces and teaches us. Anti-racist knowledge production is not just a segregated department in the university, a place for Black people or BIPOC or their white allies to feel good about themselves, where the university can satisfy a diversity mandate and point to as a home for Black inclusion and belonging. Anti-racist research is for everyone. Toni Morrison is part of a long and enduring community of knowledge producers, that is, Black women and men as, quote, perfecters of democracy, as Nicole Hannah-Jones, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and creator of the 1619 Project, calls them. Morrison is part of a community that includes Stacey Abrams and Latasha Brown, to be given credit for the recent victories in Georgia, alongside abolitionist Sojourner Truth and civil rights leader and activist Ella Baker. Anti-racist research is for everyone. In a future version of the University of Oregon or of Harvard University or anywhere, we might hope and expect that all of our children might be required to learn about the very experiences of people who've looked into the abyss and survived. And I'm not just name checking the greatest Black women hits in American history. I'm saying no one gets to claim an American greatness of any kind or to boast of any legitimate form of our nation's moral leadership in the world as the oldest liberal democracy and as a beacon of freedom and hope in the world without understanding what Black people have faced and overcome and done for the nation. I'm reminded of a joke that circulated on Facebook shortly, and my wife is sitting here with me as my audience of one, and she often says, I don't like that joke, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's so revealing. The joke circulated shortly after the Alabama Democrat Roy Jones won a Senate seat to replace Jeff Sessions as he moved into the Trump administration in the early days. Of course, Roy Jones just lost to Alabama football coach, and on the record, probably one of the least informed people to ever serve in the high chamber. But here's the joke. So a cruise ship was about to sink. The white people looked amongst themselves for someone to pray out in the great expanse of the ocean. People were afraid they were about to die, but no one wanted to pray for their eternal souls. And so with tears in his eyes, the ship captain suddenly spotted one of his Black crew members. He pointed to his finger at her and he shouted, "You, pray for us." This Black woman, afraid she might be punished for not following the captain's orders, agreed and started her prayer. And she said, "Lord, as I was boarding this ship today, it said whites only. When I wanted to use the bathroom, the sign said whites only. When I went to eat dinner on this cruise ship, the sign said whites only. So Lord, as this ship is about to sink, I pray that you takes whites only. Now, you can see in this story precisely the metaphor of the relationship of Black people at the center of the nation. And you can see in this story that the cruise ship is American democracy teetering on the edge of capsizing. And you can hear in the echo of this joke, Toni Morrison's warning in 1995 about a future where it can happen here. For over 200 years, African Americans have been at the vanguard of making real the promises of American democracy. From Frederick Douglass to Fannie Lou Hamer, Black people have led and inspired efforts that improve the quality of life for everyone, and in the process reshaped the globe. And yet, to this day, most Americans remain deeply ambivalent or terribly misinformed about this history. And of course, this summer's massive millions in the streets protesting the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd presage the possibility of a different and more informed future. But make no mistake, it is impossible to understand the United States from the election of Barack Obama in 2008 to Donald Trump in 2016 and to where we stand at the precipice of change in this moment without understanding what versions of American history animate the minds of Native citizens and immigrant newcomers alike. University educated leaders are not just solving for societal problems that work because of shared values in light of this history. They are also solving for a system built by design to exploit and extract from some people for the benefit of others. That these systems are not the same today as they were 200 years ago does not mean that new updates and new innovations have not also resulted in new forms of systemic racism. Without stating too much the obvious, mass incarceration is not a Jim Crow invention, but a post-civil rights movement one. And mass caging at the border happened in the 21st century. All psychologists and philosophers and theologians know that beliefs have always been more powerful than science. Beliefs are sticky, facts are not. And building any scientific enterprise is also an act of creation, because human beings use their imaginations to figure out what is possible in order to achieve the impossible. When universities treat anti-racist research like treating their Black citizens as optional or as raw material for profit and creation, they are defining the enterprise of Black studies, of ethnic and indigenous studies, of critical race studies, you name it, as a kind of management tool to assuage the demands of student and faculty activists. And indeed, in the end, they are putting all our lives in jeopardy. The stark realities of the COVID-19 pandemic is not just the overrepresentation of Black, brown, and indigenous deaths, especially among essential workers. More people will die because of vaccine hesitancy, because of the failure of the medical profession and public health professionals to build trust in these communities. So the role of higher education and professional schools in particular have a foundational role and have had in maintaining these structures of racism. Their policies of excluding most of the US population were intentionally implemented and must be intentionally eliminated. These institutions were not just white and male, and for most schools, for the propertied and the privileged. Since their founding, colleges and universities, public and private, produced knowledge that centered the lived experience of those who had always populated them. The defense of racial inequality as a skills gap problem of broken Black and brown people is the intellectual tradition and social foundation upon which these schools stand. And let me be clear about this. Most of the economists that I know teaching in most places are still solving for inequality by figuring out how to fix individuals who just haven't quite figured out how to play the game, a rigged game at that. More recently, our medical schools, business schools, policy schools, public health schools, and law schools have embraced a commitment to diversifying the faculty and staff, of course, with limited results. Most have only scratched the surface of changing the core curriculum of how professionals are trained in the first place. Dismantling intentional system of exclusions, of course, is the key work. And it's not just happening at somebody else's campus, as Aisha Ahmad indicated. The defense of extractive policies and the maldistribution of resources on the basis of racial logics starts at the university, in our training of future policymakers, in our business and law schools, in all the places that we teach others how to lead. We train students who become leaders of civil society to see racism as an artifact of the past, as something aberrational, as an elective we might opt into exploring, as something that will be solved with the next election. If I might quote from my own school's strategic diversity plan put in place just a few years ago, taking a class on race, and I quote, was a learning opportunity for underrepresented perspectives. And I can't even begin to tell you in great length how this notion of an underrepresented perspective stands in as the commitment of the university for what I call anti-racist research. Let me give you a couple specific examples. Amongst the leadership at my university, shortly after I arrived, one of our deans told me that she was glad that I was able to find community outside of the Harvard Kennedy School because, of course, the area that I worked in was not a major research area, and that it was a good thing that I could find intellectual community elsewhere at the university. I also witnessed my second year the retirement after 25 years of the assistant dean of diversity, who stood up at her retirement party after being handed a Tiffany bowl at the urging of student leaders who said, "Why are you leaving?" And she said, "Because I've been disrespected here for 25 years and never had the budget commensurate with the task of doing diversity effectively at this school." I was blown away. I'd never heard anybody in all my professional years, someone admit to precisely the terms of their separation when we're all supposed to pretend that she's just moving on to better pursuits. I also know from my students that our current dean would often say that he believed in diversity, but he just didn't have resources to address the low enrollment and the lack of sufficient resources to support students who could come but couldn't quite foot the bill of $100,000 to get a degree because Black alumni didn't give enough to the diversity work, as if the work of addressing diversity is just for Black alumni to fix, when in fact the wealth gap would tell us that Black people are never going to fix the inequality problems of institutions because those institutions have been creating the inequality problem in the first place. And finally, I remember getting into a heated argument with my own dean when I named the content of an exhibition on redlining, only to be told that we couldn't call it structural racism because some people might disagree with that term, and then said it was editorializing. To which I argued, if any of our colleagues put together an exhibition on climate change, would he say that calling climate change a response to greenhouse gas emissions was an editorial opinion? And lastly, of course, when Mitch Daniels just a few years ago described the recruitment of magical Black faculty, something akin to spotting a rare creature in the forest, only illustrates just how profound in this moment, if we just sift through the haze of the smoke-filled Capitol grounds and get beyond the excesses and extremes of the Trump administration, realize how deeply entrenched these problems are across all of our universities. I ask you, by way of analogy, is gender bias, sexual harassment, or white male-centered norms of leadership an underrepresented perspective, something we might explore if we choose to do so? Our current president at Harvard has talked explicitly about the enduring and old problem of sexual assault and harassment on campus. And I quote Larry Bacow, "Most critically, the data support the reality that sexual assault and sexual harassment remain a serious problem at Harvard and at institutions of higher education across the country. We must do more to prevent sexual and gender-based harassment and assault, and to encourage people to come forward to share their experiences and their concern with us. And we must not rest until every member of our community has confidence in their institution's ability to support them. This responsibility starts with the university leadership, but we can only truly affect meaningful change when with your ideas and your commitment," end quote. While this is a start, the university is still struggling to do for anti-racism what it is doing for gender-based discrimination sparked by the Me Too movement. What are the Title IX trainings and policies for racist, pedagogical, and intellectual traditions in the classroom, as well as micro and macroaggressions at the university? The lack of attention to acknowledging institutionally these problems is even more striking in a nation slipping closer to a second civil war, where at this hour, National Guardsmen are guarding the Capitol. My colleagues, Mahzarin Banaji, the co-creator of the implicit association test, and sociologist Frank Dobbin, and I have written a report, now a couple of years ago, for President Bacow. And we delivered this report at his bequest with the charge to help solve the problem of diversity, inclusion, and belonging at Harvard. And I quote what we wrote. Research on diversity and inclusion programs should inform decision-making across the schools, for only knowledge of the research can help schools to avoid repeating past mistakes. And I said this today over and over again in nearly every meeting. Every part of the university has to look closely at its own behavior, its own past, in order to build shared knowledge about what happened in the past and how to move forward. Consider it a medical workup, a diagnostic, in order to properly treat the disease. We added, in many instances, the evidence of what doesn't work is much stronger than what does. We advise university leaders to be historically literate about past diversity and inclusion efforts at Harvard and elsewhere before they begin this work. And these historical examples are powerful lessons on how to avoid pathways that lead to dead ends and poor results. We caution against the common desire by leaders to take immediate action or show short-term results, often in response to student pressure or controversy. This often leads to the problem of diversity washing, where symbolism and marketing are privileged over substantive organizational change. We also cited in our study some research by Ruth Enid Zambrana, who has emphasized how diversity talk, that is speaking frequently about diversity and inclusion, can have the effect of substituting for the work itself. We may not be witnessing much progress at all, rather experiencing the power that language has to create illusions of progress. So let me end on an encouraging note. I'm inspired by the example of the first Ivy League Black president and first woman president as well of any Ivy League school, former Brown University president Ruth Simmons, and current president of Prairie View A&M just outside of Houston, Texas. She has set an example of the kind of truth-telling that should happen at every university across every part of the university, and then set about the task of institutionalizing a transformed place. She set aside $10 billion of an endowment to support the local community of Providence schools, to ensure that an extractive institution rooted in the slave trade of the Brown brothers that helped to seed the money that started the university and the enslaved people that helped to build it would give back to the very community for which it had once extracted from. She established new centers of learning to center anti-racist research within the university so that everyone would have an opportunity to learn and to build on that knowledge so as to build a healthy and safe world. And finally, just as a personal take on this, although my daughter, who's now a freshman at Northwestern, thought she might want to go to Brown University, she didn't actually get in. When we visited the campus, the very first stop of the tour started with an Indigenous land acknowledgement, as well as a recognition of the labors of those who had once been enslaved on that campus. That may seem a small gesture given all that I've talked about, but the truth is that that's where socialization begins. That's where universities begin to change the story of who they are. And they begin to make possible a new future, a new beginning, a new climate, a new place that believes in something more powerful than simply passing on the wisdom of the ages, which of course remains still an important part of the university. I'm also inspired by change at my own school. May have sounded like I was beating up on my employer, and I think that the truth is that if we, particularly who are tenured faculty members, don't lead in this work, then we aren't contributing to the change that we often complain about. And so I just want to say that the Kennedy School responded not too long after the Floyd protests were gripping the nation, and not too long after our president issued his own solidarity statement to institutionalize a new core class on race and racism that began this fall. And I had the good fortune of teaching it along with a collaborator and co-instructor, Professor Sandra Smith, who also happens to be the first Black woman tenured ever at the Harvard Kennedy School, who started this summer. That's an example of progress, and I hope suggests the possibility that all of those listening to this call today recognize that as much as we have to learn from the past and critique the present, we do have choices to make. What happened in the Capitol is who we are. It's who we have always been, but it's not who we always must be. The future of America, of our democracy, of our economy, of our moral standing in the world depends largely on the fate of Black people, as it always has, and most especially on what we can teach others about those experiences at the university, at colleges, in our homes, in our churches, in our synagogues, and in our communities. The future depends not on transcendence, but on embracing the history of these people who struggled for an equal place in society, the people whose legacy helped make marriage equality possible, or gender equity real, or pave the way for birthright citizenship for the children of Asian, Latin American, and African immigrants. These are people who experienced and helped to defeat anti-democratic forces, or who lived under and resisted fascist regimes within the United States. People whose experiences stretch from coast to coast and encompass a century of Jim Crow that ruled martially over the lives of African Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese immigrants, and Japanese internees. We can choose to build a new America, new universities. We can see anti-racist research not as an unfortunate diversion from the inevitable march towards progress, but rather as a necessary component to it. We can make it plain to the youngest citizens and newcomers alike that US democracy is in fact contingent on learning from the past, not overcoming it. Democracy can expand or contract, include or exclude, protect or destroy. But a democracy of the racially vulnerable and economically insecure is not a democracy worthy of its name. And so let me close with this final line. On this eve of Dr. King's birthday, his legacy should remind us that we can't move forward without reckoning with our past. And we can't wish for equality and freedom in the nation or in the world or at the university or in the workplace without intentionally committing to that work, not just in words, but in deeds. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Muhammad. Wonderful talk. In a related conversation about your work, Darren Walker called you an incandescent light in the constellation of leaders for this country and the world. And your remarks made clear that he was not exaggerating, right on time.
Thank you, thank you.
We are getting ready to enter the question and answer part of our program. And I'd like to start that part off with a question about reparations. It builds on a sort of thread that you weave through your talk and the importance of actually beginning anew while also making choices that reflect the commitment to justice. Could you talk to us a bit about what you think about reparations? What are the strongest arguments for bringing them to pass?
Yeah. Well, you know, this is a really great question, and I've been learning a lot. So just for the broader audience, I want to say that William Darity has written a book with a co-author. The book is called From Here to Equality, and it is both a history of reparations efforts, largely both rhetorically in terms of what enslaved people owed in the antebellum period, all the way to early 20th century efforts by a woman named Callie House, who wanted to take the model of pensions of Civil War veterans to apply to that dying generation of enslaved people. So I lift up that work just because I think it's important to study this issue because it's complex. So let's be clear. In the tradition of liberal democracies and capitalist nations, money counts. Money talks, money matters. And so far be it for a nation that understands the relationship of money and resources to recompense, to atonement. How many corporations have been found guilty of outright death contributing behavior, like Purdue Pharma, for example. And I'm drawing a blank on the latest payments. Oh, Boeing, for example. So there's no punishment. No one's going to jail, but they're going to pay billions of dollars in money. So the idea that the harm directed for over 250 years to people of African descent, then compounded by 100 years of Jim Crow, and now compounded by 50 years of mass incarceration, ought to be resolved without some kind of cash payout. It just doesn't make sense by the very terms and standards that this country has established what atonement or restitution looks like. So yes, it begins with payment, and it also then moves to a series of intense, sustained historical reckonings that might include, and what I would argue should include, universal bias education. Let me give an example of what I mean by this. I think about these histories that I've evoked, these narratives of how to make meaning from our democracy, as truth serum to the mythologies that have killed people for a long time. And I use that language very intentionally because I think this is a matter of life and death. And so if we could imagine the virus of racism being solved, we could also imagine what a vaccine might look like in order to solve for that problem. And I believe that whether it's in the context of reparations, we move the political needle on this, or even outside of it, just as a matter of a political advocacy campaign, we ought to be vaccinating our children against the virus of racism and hate. And that looks like anti-Black racism, anti-brown racism. It looks like anti-gay, anti-trans. The notion that bias can kill people is as significant as the work that we do with sex education, in the ways that we teach children not to harm themselves and others by acts of gender-based violence or misuse of their own sexuality. So the two coupling with some kind of actual meaningful cash payment to the descendants of those who have experienced this massive system of systemic racism, as well as a commitment to historical reckoning that isn't just about programming and adult-based learning, but also a fundamental commitment that in a tradition of post-Holocaust and post-genocide, we will never forget what happened.
Thank you, Professor Muhammad. One more question as we get ready to go into the public question and answer period. One more question about sort of your maturation intellectually as a young Black man on a historically white campus. As we think about our own students here at the University of Oregon, what resources did you rely on? What were your coping mechanisms, and what advice do you have for Black students today and their allies?
Well, so I will say that I was part of an incredible community at Rutgers. And, it's hard to imagine what my experience might have been without it. But the truth is that when I was matriculating at Rutgers in 1995 as a graduate student, the president of the university was actually an Americanist historian, a guy named Dick McCormick, who had taken over for Francis Lawrence, who had basically gotten in trouble for signing off on the bell curve and caused mayhem on campus. And so an enlightened American historian took over the leadership and committed himself to cluster hiring as well as graduate funding that would bring cohorts of graduate students. So the protective skein of a community of people who were in this together was really what made my graduate experience incredible. And frankly, I'm going to name drop here to brag, but Jelani Cobb, who's a staff writer for the New Yorker and faculty member at Columbia University, we started together. We didn't quite finish together. He got out a little faster than me, but I'm not sure I could have done it without him. And there were others, which in the interest of time, I won't name all their names. But this is what helped me. And of course, my beautiful partner in life, who was always supporting my work. And so, self-care really matters, whether that comes in the form of the people who you are working with, or it comes in the form of the people who love you and receive you at the end of a hard day. I think rooting yourself in a community of love in order to do this work, and this is true for all graduate studies because it's not easy, but I think it's particularly hard when you're doing this work against the inertia of exclusion and passivity that often makes people feel like that it's not a meaningful experience.
Thanks. So speaking of graduate school and graduate students, one of our graduate students has a comment. He writes, lack of understanding of medical racism could derail progress for the entire global society. A group at MIT ran a computational analysis of the current Pfizer and Moderna vaccines might be slightly less effective in Black and brown people because the samples used in the initial design were less inclusive of minorities. Universities must emphasize to researchers making curative solutions for society to factor in the total representation of society, or else all efforts come to naught. Building on your talk, he offers that as an initial.
I love it, and I appreciate you offering a comment and not insisting that it be a question, because I think in moments like these, I am not the sage, wise person on the hill looking down on people receiving information. Thank you for that comment. I'll also just say, aside from everything we know about medical racism and the failures of the public health system, I mean, the entire U.S. Public Health Service has a terrible history of experimenting on Black bodies. It's not just the clinical trials in a matter of what might be some comorbidity that is showing up in a lot of African Americans that has an adverse effect when interacting with the vaccine, because I want to make a clear distinction between genetic differences and chronic illness representation in the population. Those two things are not the same. But it's also about perception of the end user. And so if Black people perceive that Black people weren't part of the clinical trials, and they'll be more skeptical about whether or not it's going to work for them. So thank you for the comment.
Thanks. So our next question is about actually teaching in the classroom. And this faculty member starts off by saying, wonderful talk. I'm curious to hear more about Dr. Muhammad's thoughts about standard academic English, the formal language we use in universities and speeches to convey our ideas. I teach first-year writing, and we are discussing how we teach and assess the expectations of, quote, standard, unquote, English from an anti-racist perspective. Any suggestions or comments would be most welcome.
Either I have been out of the undergraduate classroom for too long, or something is going on. I did a talk a few months ago at a college in Rochester, New York, and this question came up. And so I might sound like an old fogey here, and maybe it's just born of my actual classroom experience, but I've just never had, I don't teach obviously writing, I teach history, and my students write as a result. But I've just never had I've never had to confront the linguistic question about accommodating people's language styles who are using English, but in more vernacular form. Obviously, the extent to which English for second language learners ought to be accommodated within the university is a no-brainer. But, English is the language of European conquest and colonization, but it is also a lingua franca that is a basic skill required to communicate. So at most, I'd say, stick to the standard English as best you can and teach everyone Spanish.
Okay. So now this next question takes us into the realm of partnerships or minority serving institutions. And she writes, could you share some thoughts on the role of HBCUs in creating and educating academics and thought leaders outside of the framework of white supremacist educational institutions?
A great question, and this is kind of an easy one, which is that HBCUs have long over-indexed for producing Black professionals in America, period, hard stop. And the irony, of course, that those HBCUs are chronically underfunded, particularly public ones, but the private ones struggle as well because, again, within the larger context that I opened this talk with regard to the maldistribution of Black people in powerful positions, means that we've got a lot of bunching of successful Black people at middle manager positions and not in elite decision-making positions. And in a capitalist society, that means on average, Black people won't have the resources to get back to their institutions, even though Black women are the most generous people in America based on per capita spending for philanthropic purposes. That being said, there is a huge opportunity for elite and public and private. And I say elite because ones that are not elite will have less capacity to do this kind of work, but they ought to partner in explicit ways. They should not leave it to chance that talented Black and brown undergraduates who don't have the option of matriculating into a professional school on their campuses because they go to a baccalaureate school should want these students on their campuses. They should intentionally do this work. And to give credit to my own professional school at the Kennedy School, we do have infrastructure to support that kind of outreach. We got another problem with the admissions committee and the shenanigans that go on there, but we've at least built a pipeline. So I appreciate the question. You know, I think HBCUs have long over contributed to the kind of democracy perfection that I've referred to. I will say as a side note, just so that I have some credibility, the HBCUs also aren't the most progressive when it comes to teaching anti-racist research. And so they ought to also follow this prescription, because too often there's a trade-off for talented first generation college students who go to HBCUs, which is, you know, just sort of make good on the promises of material success and professional accolades, and they kind of bypass some of this work that needs to be done. So I do hope that more of them decide to opt into both anti-racist research communities on their campuses, but also in the professional realm as well.
Our next topic is really focused on politics, and to get your insights on what the next administration, this historic Biden-Harris administration, should focus on, of course, against the historic backdrop of an Obama presidency and a Trump presidency. What would be your top 3 agenda items for this administration to address with respect to the issues that are dear and near to your heart?
Yeah, well, I literally just got asked by Politico to answer this exact question, so I'll consider this a first draft response. But first, I have to think about what is the federal government capable of doing, because too often we have expectations of magic solutions. Now, the federal government can do a lot of damage through executive orders, but when it comes to building things, the federal government runs headlong into the states and what they control. So the first thing I'd say is if Joe Biden ought to find language and a public voice for the kind of vision of an America that recognizes its racist past while embracing a multiracial future. We just didn't have it in the Obama administration, and I understand why. And the reason I want to use the contrast is because this is an opportunity to get it right a second time. And that is that if you look at most presidents, they have disciplined Black people for being the problem of racial inequality. Bill Clinton was famous for this, which is exactly the context in which Joe Biden gained his most important legacy, of which until recently running for president, he was quite proud of having signed off on every crime bill that you could sign off on or lead. So Obama chose a high road, which is to say, to not acknowledge the ongoing problems of systemic racism, to appeal to our better angels. but it didn't work. Tea Party got stronger and mightier. The counter narratives to push back against the lies of criminality and low IQs. I mean, people on news are still talking about low IQ people as some kind of dog whistle, for Black and brown people. So I think of this like a scientist would. I don't think we can solve this problem if we keep looking for the problem somewhere else other than in the test tube where it resides. And so we need to focus squarely on it. We need to look at it for what it is. And Biden can lead in that way. If he drops the ball on this, he's going to hand Kamala Harris potentially a secession plan to the White House, which is going to put back on another Black person the responsibility for leading the country to come to terms with a moral reckoning. No other country in the world that has experienced the death and destruction that is ethnically or racially based like the United States has gotten away with the same constitution operating under the same logics with the same lies and deceits and monuments to hate that the United States have. It's just a fact. So somebody's got to take the lead on this, and why not Joe Biden? I'm rooting for you, Joe. The other thing I'll say is that he's going to have to basically reinstitutionalize the apparatus of consent decrees to deal with policing in America. I mean, we have absolute evidence now that retired police chiefs, current police chiefs, rank and file police officers, current military, ex-military, got on their buses and planes and went to the Capitol for January 6th. I mean, how many times do we have to keep insisting on this rotten apple theory of policing in America? Every major union in America has supported Donald Trump over the past 4 years and in this election as well. So we have a systemic policing problem. Are there lots of good officers who mean well? Absolutely, but that is not the issue. This would be like saying, are there lots of people like my wife and I who stay in our home most of the time are not likely to get COVID, so we shouldn't get the vaccine? It doesn't matter what these individual cops are doing. The system is broken. And Joe Biden needs to take affirmative, intentional efforts to fix a system. And, I know I'm going on, but I have to catch myself because the system is actually doing what it was built to do. But if we want to take the approach that we're now in a new day of possibility, then this system built to do what it's doing needs to be fixed to do something quite differently. And that's going to take carrots and sticks, probably a lot more sticks because the carrots are limited. They can pull federal resources, but until we define a vision of policing and justice in this country, of which the federal government has the capacity to do, that is to define it, it can't execute it, then I think we're stuck with it. I think that the last thing is, for me, the Green New Deal and Medicare for All are just waiting there for the taking. I could go on with a whole nother speech about what I call American socialism, which is essentially the hybrid economy that we have that has propped up low income and middle income white people since the Homestead Act of 1862. Giving them land, resources, abilities, low interest loans to farm. And later on with the New Deal, with all of its alphabet package of jobs and guaranteed work, Social Security, unemployment benefits, eventually beautiful homes in the suburbs, all with explicit effects of discrimination against Black people. And so when we talk about a 10 times wealth gap, when we talk about reparations, we're talking about the legacy and consequences of American socialism. We have an opportunity. We have a massive infrastructure problem in America. He ought to spend the kind of money that we saw we're capable of spending to save our planet and to focus on people who have been historically excluded from the kinds of jobs programs that helped make white America what it has been.
And so where would you fit in higher education, especially students who are struggling against loan debt and things of that nature? The demands for free education and all of these, where would that fit?
So I'll admit my political loyalties were with Elizabeth Warren. And again, I do believe we may not be able to pay for everything at one time, but we most certainly could wipe out student debt. We could make college free if we prioritized it. The idea that it's a race to the bottom for no taxes, low taxes, is an absurdity that should come to an end in this moment. the notion that the liberals are going to take your money and tax you into poverty really just means that we're going to keep a society that's profoundly unequal, that death is premature for people who have to get up and go to work to keep the ICU units working for other people to live on. I mean, it's crazy. And philanthropy has become a mechanism for laundering wealth to the point where, to quote Dr. King, philanthropy is good, but we shouldn't need philanthropy. We should fix the policies that create the conditions of maldistribution of wealth in the first place. So we have a lot of opportunity to level set, to redress what has been 40 years of a divestment in our public goods, in our public sector, a dismantling of government that has led us to a possibility of the destruction of government. All of these are predictable outcomes of an anti-government ideology that has racked America for a long time. As my colleague Jonathan Metzl has written about, the dying of whiteness because white people who need healthcare are voting against healthcare for fear that healthcare is the Trojan horse of socialism, a socialism that already exists for 65-year-olds called Medicare. I mean, again, but as I said in my speech, where higher education is concerned, partly because we have helped to produce some of these leaders who manipulate our political landscape and our political marketplace. And we have helped to produce many of these business leaders who are more interested in profit than personhood. We need to educate an entirely new generation of future leaders to a different set of values, let's call them anti-racist values, which intersect with every set of public policy issues that we can imagine, including the existential threat of climate change.
Dr. Muhammad, we have a few more questions left, but I want to point out how resilient you are and how much stamina you have. You've literally been with us since 8:30 this morning, and you're still popping. So thank you. Just hold on. We're almost at the end. So a question from a faculty member who teaches a class on special education. This is what he asks. I want my students to be able to think about research, the research that they read, and who implements the research, and how they write and how they interpret their results. Do you have any suggestions on how to center their minds when they read articles and think about how they translate the research they read into practice in their classrooms? And again, this is special education. Thank you for an incredible talk.
So this is a question about the pedagogical approach to help teachers help their future special ed education students see themselves in their work. Is that right? There's a couple of loops there. I want to make sure I get them.
Yes. Well, and also making sure that they understand what they're reading and how they translate that research into practice in the classroom. So if you're talking about anti-racism, how is it that a student then translates that research into the practices of what's going on in the classroom, making classrooms more inclusive, in this case, for special ed students?
Yeah. I'd have to give, I think it's a basic question as opposed to the context of, getting caught between the teachers learning how to teach and in special ed context. So I'm going to pull all that away and say, how do you teach teachers to do anti-racism in the classroom, no matter what classroom it is? And the first step is that anti-racism starts with recognizing that the value of the people in front of you will demand of you the recognition of what you don't know about who they are. And I'm not making an essentialist claim here. When I talked about assimilation in the context of my prepared remarks, we have, all of us within university contexts, no matter whether we're teaching teachers or simply teaching students who are going to go out and be whatever they're going to do with their lives, we have been teaching them that there is a universal subject who is the model of success. And that universal subject has a clear enlightenment origin story that leads us to forms of knowledge that have helped produce great tools for civilization, whether it is the printed word or a smartphone. And what is implied in that story, and it shows up in almost every field of discipline in the canonical way in which we talk and teach and approach knowledge, is that we are signaling to our students at every turn, particularly ones who are not represented by those European traditions, that they're along for the ride. Mm-hmm. So I think part of this is just the thoughtfulness of the critiques and the exposure of the ways that things that we assume are standard, and I'm not talking about English here, I'm talking about ways of knowing what we know, are themselves creatures of cultural ways of being. I'll be more specific just as a quick example. So I teach my students the limits of empiricism, because not only is econ perhaps the most common major at Harvard, but economic ways of thinking dominate how students are trained to be mature adults, literally, to be responsible with their money. I mean, I can't tell you one quick digression. This is kind of an example. Like, the solution to the Great Recession for banks that cheated Black and brown people out of their money was to settle, no one went to jail, and then the settlement was to support financial literacy training. As if to say that our wonderful capitalist system is fine. All the people who are the capitalists manipulating the system to make money for themselves are fine. The only thing that we need to fix is you, so that the next huckster that calls you up and says, man, have I got a deal for you, will know to say, no, that's not really a good deal. Now, come on, John, you know you can do better than that. And in that little glib example is what's happening in our classrooms when we take for granted that the received wisdom of our fields doesn't have shortcomings. And so, you know, it's about literature, it's about stretching beyond the ways that most of what we've been taught as adults in a classroom are flawed themselves. I'll point to, for example, if you look inside of, this is not true for every field, I'll admit, but there are almost shadow professional societies that come with national in the title rather than American. National Medical Association, National Association of Black Accountants, National Association of Black Social Workers. So sometimes it's national and sometimes it's Black and sometimes it's both. They all produce research. They produce professional standards. So if you're serious about anti-racism as a teacher teaching teachers how to connect with their students in the classroom, use some of that research, attend those conferences. The conference that I attend is called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, founded by Carter G. Woodson, who gave us Black History Month. ASALH is attended by lots of white people who teach history because they want to learn how to do a better job of it. Okay, I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Khalil. So our next question is one that's combined. So actually we have a couple more. So let's go with the question about service. All right. So I'd like to invite your thoughts or suggestions around the existence of our possibility for institutional accountability without the excess of uncompensated Black labor. As you've recognized, institutions tend to see the work of anti-racism as the work of Black folks. And indeed, we do have critical knowledge. How do we move forward without continuing to reinscribe this dynamic of providing labor without compensation, but still maintain a voice in these processes of change?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I teach my students, this is kind of a takeaway. So they usually get this lesson at the end of 14 weeks. But we start a long, long time ago, and then we get to the present. And when we get to the present, what they've learned essentially is that racism is white people's problem. It's their creation, they came up with it. It was the justification for slavery and every other form of exploitation and extraction. It never had any basis in fact. I mean, we kind of all know this, but sometimes we get lost in the present because we're like, well, those people are sagging their pants and they're not working as hard, so there must be a there there. So the there, of course, it always has a very myopic view because it only sees what it wants to see. It ignores the rest when it can point to other people who either made a choice or been locked out, who happen to be white. So racism is the logic of ascribing group attributes to individuals as representation of some kind of failing. And I'm actually fading here. I forgot my point to that question. Did that remind me of the question?
So the question is about uncompensated Black labor.
Oh, right. So yeah, so thank you. So when you have it being white people's problem, then of course they have to fix this. And if they're not fixing it, if they're not leading in an effort to do the labor to get this work done, then it's not going to happen. It's not just about Black people doing uncompensated work. It's actually not going to happen. Those are two different things. It's one thing for you and me to lead this work either because it's in your job description or because it's a kind of citizenship commitment. But I can guarantee you from history, it won't happen. You know, you'll come and go, someone will come behind you, I'll come and go, someone will come behind me, but the actual work of systemic racism won't actually end. And the reason being because the stakeholders of that work will not have committed themselves to solving that problem. So to answer your question, leaders, presidents, provosts, not only have to make this a priority in a way that is not just a gesture to crisis management, they have to have conversations with the stakeholders who they report to, who it is not their priority. And in that, they increase budgetary resources, sometimes because they redirect, meaning that it's not about the pie growing to do diversity, it's about saying, you know what, we can't be the university we're going to be because we're going to have to do this in a serious and meaningful way. So here's the answer to your question. I told this to a group of people earlier. If we're going to hire faculty who we expect to make a contribution to anti-racist research and community building, then that ought to be part of the job description and it ought to be part of the recruiting conversation. People ought to know what they're signing up for. The second thing is university leaders ought to make it clear that, as many people say, I'll just borrow the quip, a budget is a moral document. And the degree to which you can look at the sausage of the budget and see how much this really matters will tell you a lot about where leadership sits on this question and how much of the work will be divvied out. It is also the case that whether it's in higher education or in the private sector, if the person responsible for diversity is not reporting directly to the provost or president, then diversity is probably not that important. It is also true that if that person is a staff of to that person and an executive assistant, then diversity is also not that important. So there has to be a community of commitment and learning that starts with leadership appropriating the resources. And it also starts with middle leaders, the deans, the chairs, letting go of this notion that their brains that are really big and powerful are dumb around these questions. I can't tell you how many people I've met who at Harvard, at Indiana University, at other places, other institutions are incredibly smart people. They get put in charge of all sorts of things because in some cases they've made lots of money doing this or that, and they get to run this nonprofit and they get to run for mayor and they get to do this. But when it comes to solving for racism, all of a sudden, they don't really understand how it works. And yet they come from communities that live with the mythologies and lies of racial hierarchy. So some of it is just basic honesty and commitment to the work and recognizing that the ways of being and doing probably have to change in uncomfortable ways. And once you get past the discomfort, you know, it's kind of like wearing a mask because you can't freaking breathe, but you have to talk through it anyway. Like, you know, maybe we get to the other side over a period of time.
Speaking about the other side, we'll end on this question. Based on your personal hope for the nation's future, what is your opinion on how history will tell the story of the vitriol we witnessed last week?
I actually said this to someone the other day, that I think the first and second drafts of history, which are being written right now, second drafts of the early days of this administration, the first drafts of what just happened, are going to be pretty accurate in ways that I think, I mean, historians almost always rely on news reporting from the past in order to understand how people were thinking and moving. I don't know how much hindsight is going to be 2020 for what we've already seen, which is a way of saying that I can't predict where we're headed. But if we were writing the history of the end of the Trump administration as of January 20th, 2021, I think we're already seeing it play out on our phones, in our news reporting. And the reason why I say that, which is a risky thing to say because it's hard to know that we're seeing everything that's happened in this moment, is because I've never in my lifetime seen, and this is a good example, this is maybe a note of inspiration to end on. What isn't happening in every pocket of the university in terms of the ways in which race and racism intersect in all forms of knowledge, from how our doctors are trained, to our dentists are trained, to our lawyers are trained, to our undergraduates are trained, to policy, all of that, right? We already talked about it. But I've never seen so many journalists get it so right so quickly. And therefore, I think it's the interplay of social media and the democratization of forms of observation and analysis and knowledge, which is not the disinformation side. I'm not saying this is an uncomplicated space, but if we were to take the sum total of all that social media activity and all the ways in which it's more than just professional journalists interpreting, or I should say recording, which is more like what they're supposed to do as opposed to interpret it, recording what's happening. There's a lot of interpreting happening in social media. And that play between those two communities is yielding what I think is going to stand up pretty robustly. So if the questioner wanted me to say whether I think this period is over, I can't say that. All I can say is that we've seen perhaps the most racist political movement crystallize in the highest positions of power for both a president and a number of congresspeople, state legislators, and other public officials across the United States in ways that are hard to compare other than 100 years ago in the Woodrow Wilson administration, which was sort of the first moment where that kind of leadership consensus crystallized in ways that was not true for Reconstruction era presidents and the period shortly after. A Teddy Roosevelt who preceded a Woodrow Wilson by way of a William Howard Taft was way more like Eisenhower than anything that Woodrow Wilson or Donald Trump could compare to. And just for our people who don't really remember Woodrow Wilson's administration, that was the moment when, and not many people have made this comparison, it was just before the end of his term, the Klan held a national rally on the Mall and took over Washington, D.C. So we are seeing, I won't call it unprecedented, but we are seeing the most naked displays of racism in ways that do suggest that the next few years could lead to something that none of us want to witness. This could be more like the election of Abraham Lincoln as opposed to the election of Ulysses S. Grant. Two different moments in our history. So.
All right, Khalil. Dr. Muhammad, we did say that was the last question, but you have to leave us with some hope.
All right, well, here's the hope. We're here, right? 149 people have remained when we started with 228. So 149 people now down to 147 have signed up for something. I think that's a reason to be hopeful. As long as we keep talking about this, we're not killing each other. That's a start. And I think that everyone has to take some measure of optimism that we have the ability to change all of this. We just do. But it's going to take a willingness to do that work and not to convince ourselves somehow that it's somebody else's job.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. President Schill, final comments?
Professor Muhammad, I just want to thank you very much. What an inspiring and really provocative talk. And I know that we're going to be talking about it for a long time. You mentioned, the former president of Brown, who was also a speaker in our series about 2 speakers ago, and we are still talking about her speech today. And so yours will be talked about for the remainder of the year, if not into next year in the future. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, President Schill, and thank you so much, Vice President Alex Asenso. It's a real delight to have had this opportunity to get to know your community. So I look forward to seeing you as family in some future safe space.
Thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.